Hello everyone, welcome to today's lesson, Action Potential. Today we are going to explore how our brain and body actually talk to each other. So they are using something called action potential. Let's see our objectives for today. We will look on what does an action potential look like. So we will visualize a little bit how what happens at the when a neuron sends a signal. Also, we will look up on how does action potential rise. So we will break down how a tiny electrical impulse is triggered from resting to firing and back again. We will have a graph to visualize it, to help us visualize it. And also we will see how often can a neuron produce an action potential. Can neurons keep firing over and over, or how fast they can go? So my goal for today is to be able to identify, explain, and illustrate how action potentials work. At least I will try. We will start with the definition, or trying to understand what is an action potential. So an action potentials are the process by which the brain receives signals, analyze the signal, and will convey information. So the action potentials are the signals by which the brain receives, analyzes, and conveys information. These signals are highly stereotyped throughout the nervous system, so even we will see in the next slide, they are triggered by a great variety of events in the environment: light, mechanical contact, odorants, pressure waves. They are quite the same. So the action potential have several universal properties which are the same in all animal organisms with a nervous system. So we can say that the signals that convey information about vision are identical to those that carry information about odor. So the mechanism, the process is the same, is similar. We have here something that can help us a little bit visualize how a neuron will fire up. So we can do this metaphor with the sleeping guard. So we can imagine our neuron as a guard sleeping in a tower. So we can imagine that there are three ways to wake the guard. We can do it by throwing a rock and to hit the window. So it will be, and we can think as physical touch, for example, that can fire a neuron. And also it can be a messenger that will yell up a message to the guard. And it can be associated with the chemical signal we have in our nervous system, or it can be a loud alarm clock that goes off, and it would be the electrical signal. So each of these makes the guard jump up and start doing their job. So it will be the same for the neurons. One of those three ways will trigger the neuron to start doing a job. Yeah, it will fire up. So it's very similar to the depolarization that will get the neuron ready to send an electrical message. We will retake this metaphor. So let's see what can cause a membrane depolarization. We also can make another association metaphor, and we can think of a neuron like a quiet student in a class. So something has to get their attention to make them start working, right? So well, here are three things that can get a neuron's attention. So a physical poke or change like the touch. So the effects of an external physical stimulus on the neuron, yeah, can make the neuron fire. Also, the second cause of the membrane depolarization is the chemical signal. So there are little messengers called neurotransmitters that knock on the neuron's door and say, wake up, we've got work to do. So the action of neurotransmitters on the neuron membrane can cause membrane depolarization. And another way of causing membrane depolarization is exposure to an electric current. So an electric shock or signal can force the neuron to take action. So in short, a neuron starts working because of something physical, chemical, or electrical. In the next slide, we can visualize the action potential graph. So, of course, there are different types of graphs of the neurons, of the action potentials neurons. That's the most common we can see. And for the purpose of this lesson, we will discuss this type of action potential. So what happens in the neuron during the generation of an action potential? So very specific or something amazing happens at the level of the cell membrane. So the membrane flips its charge. Normally, the outside of the neuron is positive and the inside is negative. But during the action potential, during this phase, the membrane will reverse. For a very short time, the outside of the cell will become negative and the inside of the cell will become positive. So this flip in charges is what we see in the graphs. So we have here the 0 and the resting membrane potential is at minus 70. So here is resting membrane potential. When the phase of the flipping charge of the membrane will happen and it will arrive, become more positive and will hit, for example, minus 55, it will trigger and will generate the action potential, which will mean the depolarization of the membrane. The action potential happens and then the phase of repolarization and coming back to the resting potential. So why does this matter? Because this temporary change in electrical charge is the basic unit of communication in our brain and in our nervous system, and without it we couldn't move, feel, react, or even think. But we will retake the phases of the action potential to explore deeper how a neuron sends a signal, and we can do that by identifying 5 key phases. So the entire action potential happens very fast, yeah, within 2 milliseconds. That's faster than a blink. And during those 2 milliseconds, 5 stages happens. So the neurons goes through 5 stages. The first stage is ascending phase or rapid depolarization. So as we said, the membrane potential, resting membrane potential is at minus 70 millivolt. The inside of the cell is negative, the outside is positive. So if those three causes we discussed earlier happens, a stimulus will cause sodium channels to open. Sodium's ion will rush inside the neuron. They are positive. So this will make the inside more positive. Yeah, it will go up, and if it gets to the threshold, it will fire up, and the action potential will happen, will trigger an action potential due to this depolarization. So this will make the inside of the membrane more positive. The membrane potential rapidly rise, and the neuron is getting excited and ready to send the signal. The second phase is the peak of the action potential. It's the peak when we have this charge reversal. Yeah, it will become positive. It can reach, for example, 30 millivolt. Yeah, and at this point, the inside of the cell is now more positive than the outside. So a complete reversal of charge has occurred. So this signal has reached its peak, and what will happen next? Yeah, it will now begin to fall, and we are coming here to the third phase, descending phase, or repolarization. So at this phase, we have other ions coming up. The potassium channel will open. The potassium ions will exit the cell. So the positive potassium ions are positive. Positive ions will exit the cell, and the inside of the cell will become negative again. But of course, when we have this negative after potential phase, the fourth phase, yeah, this cell will become more negative than the normal state, when more negative than the resting membrane. So we have the fourth phase now, the negative after potential with the hyperpolarization, when too many potassium ions will leave the cell, which will make the inside more negative than normal. So we can call this hyperpolarization phase as a little overshoot, before returning to normal. And the normal, it's when the neuron becomes extra calm, is at minus 70 millivolt. And we now reach the fifth phase with the slow recovery to membrane resting potential, which, as we said, it's around minus 70 millivolt. What happens here? The ion pumps, like sodium potassium pump, will slowly restore the original balance. The neuron returns to its resting potential and is ready to fire again if it will be the case, of course. So the neuron recharges and gets ready for the next signal. All those 5 phases happens during 2 milliseconds, so it's very, very fast. We will explain again the mechanism of action potential generation, yeah, because it's not such an easy information to grasp. It's not that easy to understand, to visualize. So we will explain again all the 5 phases. So we start with an external stimulus which will begin to act on the membrane which contains closed sodium ion channels. The second phase, sodium ion channels under the influence of the external stimuli begin to open. The third phase, the sodium ions begin to penetrate through the open channels inside the cell along the concentration gradient. So since the sodium ions are more in the extracellular environment, so they will go inside the cell. They will enter the cell. And we get to the fourth phase. The entry of sodium ions will lead to partial depolarization membrane. So the membrane potential become more positive. If membrane for depolarization reaches critical level of depolarization membrane, then action potential appears on the membrane. So there has to be a threshold. If you remember from the previous slide, there were the threshold on the graph I showed you last time. It was around minus 55 millivolt. If the membrane depolarization reaches this critical level, the threshold, so the action potential will go up. If not, nothing will happen. So let's see about this threshold or the critical level for the action potential. We have here the membrane depolarization is the value of membrane potential of the neuron at which membrane of the neuron action potential occurs. Action potential occurs as a result of membrane depolarization to a critical threshold level. If the membrane potential does not reach the threshold, then there is no action potential on the membrane. So we can say that the action potential generation is subject to the law all or nothing. To remember this threshold on and the critical level for action potential, I made here a metaphor. We can make a metaphor with shooting a bow and arrow, and we can think of a neuron like an archer with a bow. So the membrane potential is the tension on the bowstring, and depolarization is pulling it back to shoot the arrow. So to shoot the arrow, the archer must pull the string back far enough. If they don't pull it far enough, the arrow will fall to the ground. So no action potential. If the string is pulled to a specific point, that's the threshold, and the arrow will fly. So that's the all or nothing law. Once the archer passes the threshold, the arrow will be released and it flies all the way. It can't be released half an arrow shot. It's full power or nothing, just like the neurons. If the threshold is met, the action potential fires completely. So what you should remember? You should remember that a neuron fires like an arrow from a bow. It needs just the right amount of pull or the right amount of depolarization to reach that threshold. As on the graph, it was on our specific graph, it was around minus 55 millivolts. If it's too little, nothing happens. Yeah, we need enough tension for the signals to go flying. So we need enough depolarization to the neuron to fire. And we are getting closer to our to the end of our course, and we will explain multiple action potential. So a neuron doesn't fire just once. Yeah, if it keeps getting stimulated, like from a continuous electric current, or if we touch someone, yeah, and we stroke it, yeah, several times, it can keep firing again and again, and producing more, many action potentials in a row. But what controls the frequency? Yeah, the stronger the stimulation, example, more intense touch, sound, or light, the faster the neurons fires action potential. So frequency of firing tells the brain how strong the stimulus is. So we can have here also a metaphor, and we can think of a neuron as like a drum beat. So we can imagine the neuron is a drummer, and each drum beat is an action potential. If someone barely taps the drummer, they play slowly. Well, this means the stimulus is weak. If someone pushes the drummer harder, they will play faster. So this tells the brain the stimulus is strong. So the rhythm, the frequency of the drum tells us how intense the input is. So what should you remember? You should remember that neurons send more signals and faster when the stimulus is stronger. So it's like a drummer playing louder and faster when the music gets intense. And the last slide is we also have an absolute refractory period. What's that? So is the fact that neurons can only fire up to about 1000 times per second. This means the maximum frequency is 1000 Hz. Because after each action potential, the neuron's membrane needs a brief recovery time. So this brief recovery time is the absolute refractory period. So why this absolute refractory period is needed? So it's right. It's because right after an action potential, the neurons becomes completely unresponsive for about 1 millisecond. So this period of the moment when the neurons cannot respond is called absolute refractory period. So during this time, no matter how strong a stimulus is, the neuron cannot fire action potential. Another metaphor for this concept, for this mechanism, is thinking of a camera flash. So neuron is, we can think of the neuron as a camera flash. So when we use a camera with a flash, we press the button and the flash fires. But after that, we have to wait a moment for the flash to recharge. We can't take another photo with flash immediately. So that recharge time is like the absolute refractory period for a neuron. So just like the camera needs time to be ready again, the neuron needs time to reset its membrane before it can fire again. So the key point for you to remember is that a neuron has a short rest time after each signal. And during this time, this absolute refractory period, it can't send another signal, no matter what. So the cell membrane is the time when the cell membrane will generate with great difficulties the next action potential. Okay, we just finished the presentation about our action potentials. It became a little bit long, but I hope you had enough patience to rest with me, to join me till the end. Just some key ideas to wrap up. Action potentials are electrical signals that allow neurons to send messages quickly and efficiently. Also, there is this all or nothing rule. So no half measures for neurons. Neurons operate on an all or none basis. Once the threshold is reached, an action potential fires completely. If not, it doesn't fire at all. This ensures consistent signal transmission without loss of strength. Also, we have in neurons a lot of ions, sodium and potassium ions that will play across the membrane and will create the charge changes that will drive an action potential. And also the neurons need to reset and to be able to repeat again the action potential. So after firing, neurons quickly reset with the help of ion pumps and channels, and they get ready for the next message. Okay, thank you so much for joining me today, and I will wait you for the next time. Bye.